Thank you. It was beautiful. For our reading, I wanted to read from a book, Waiting for Snow in Havana, very briefly, written by a man that I was very fortunate to become friends with, Carlos Ayer. And Carlos was like my brothers, my older brothers, in 1960-61. Carlos, my brothers, myself, we were born in Cuba. And there was a exodus of over 14,000 Cuban boys called Operation Pedro Pan. And they came and lived with sponsor families because their parents were so worried about the turn the revolution was taking. And my parents were in support of that revolution and knew Fidel personally, risked a lot to support that revolution. My father was in the revolutionary government. And when it turned from a democracy to a Soviet-style communism, like many Cubans, my father became a, quote, counter-revolutionary, was tortured and was killed. I bring this up because it relates to what I'm going to talk about later. And it also explains some of the music we'll be singing and playing today. But here's what Carlos says, because he speaks for my family. He speaks of the hatred and anger that so many Cuban Americans and our family grew up with. What I heard, what I learned when I used to march after church in front of the Cuban flag and swear that we'd go back and kill Castro. I was raised on quite a bit of anger. I was taught hatred. And I don't mean to condemn my mother or the other Cubans for that. I understand their pain. He writes, Carlos Ayer writes, all of us are responsible for our own actions. Not even Fidel is exempt from all this, nor Che, nor his chauffeurs, nor his mansions, nor the many Cubans who soiled their pants before they were shot to death. Thousands of executions, I should add, were televised, and many times blanks were in the guns. And the men thought that they were going to be killed, and they weren't, and then they were shot. That's what he's referring to. Also, what one should be held responsible for, he adds, are the, quote, 14,000 children who flew away from their parents, nor the love and desperation that caused them to fly. You're supposed to forgive your enemies, you know. Turn the other cheek if they ask for a shirt. Give them your coat. If they strike you on the right cheek, turn. Give them your left. And if they try to kill and rape you, say, thank you very much, I deserve it. Obviously, he's speaking of great pain and anger. Sam, did you come on up? On that note, Sam has offered to help me out. I'd just like you to get ready. I'm going to finish with the reading. Carlos wrote, these are tough commandments to forgive, especially if your enemies have hurt you so deeply. Too tough even for someone who's tougher than the hide on the oldest, meanest devil in hell. So I chose as our next hymn a song called Guantanamera. This is a song that is an old, those of you who know Pete Seeger, have seen him in concert, as I have, know his introduction to the song, and mine is somewhat similar. It's an old Spanish folk song. It was written, though, about a woman from Guantanamo, and I'll be talking about Guantanamo. I've done some work for the defense of the terrorists in Guantanamo, for the defense teams defending them. And this woman scorned the advances of a man. So the old folk song is actually about his hurt at being scorned. That's the refrain. The verses are from a poem by Jose Marti. I took out one of the verses about roses, but I'll explain that he writes in that verse that we're leaving out that a white rose represents love. I ask that you sing with us. If you can and are willing, please stand. You'll find the insert. One of the things I lost when I left Cuba was my first language. Yo hablo español muy poquito. I don't speak Spanish very well. So actually, I'm going to ask Tatiana, my daughter, to come up. I think you agreed, right? And Mary Grace, Sam has offered his mother to help the choir. And we're going to sing this, all of us together. Would you stand with us, please? A brief word about this.
This guitar is the guitar my mother bought. Someone gave it to her in 1962. The guitar I first heard this song on. Now the beginning is very easy. If you can't sing the verses, that's fine. If you don't speak Spanish. But let's quickly do Guantanamera. I'm throwing you a curveball. Go to Guantanamera, everybody.
Thank you, Sam. Very briefly, I'll start with just some very brief words by Abraham Lincoln. A man has not time to spend half his time in quarrels. If any man ceases to attack me, if he ceases to attack me, I never remember the past against him. Abraham Lincoln was described by his enemies and his friends alike as one of the kindest, most compassionate, and forgiving men they had ever met. This is from the book, what is the name of that book?
Team of Rivals.
Team of Rivals, thank you very much. And he also says, no man resolved to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. I agree, and that's why I'm up here. I'm not up here behind a pulpit in a church because I'm any kind of religious leader, and I'm certainly not up here as a Dr. Amador, as a psychologist. I'm not here to give advice to anyone. I'm here really today as a person who's in the past struggled, and sometimes still today, a great deal with anger and resentment, and who's discovered the power, the freedom, and even the joy that forgiveness has brought into my life. So as a virtue, sure, I agree. But as a personal discovery, that's really what I want to talk about. And in particular, one of the things I discovered is that forgiveness has turned misery. See, pain is unavoidable in life, but misery, I've discovered, is a choice. I can choose to stay miserable, to keep thinking about. And in fact, when Charlotte was playing that angry song, I was thinking about someone I've been angry with and finding that I couldn't hold on to that anger because of some things that I do now, today, almost on a daily basis, to keep forgiving that person. Because sometimes forgiveness is not like a light switch. I forgive and it's over. Sometimes the anger comes back. But it has the power to transform that kind of misery, which creates misery in the people around me when I'm angry. When I'm angry, I'm not just angry all by myself. I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm thinking about it, and the people around me suffer as well. The first minister of this church, here in this building, was Brother William Fishbaugh. They weren't called pastor or reverend or minister back in the 1830s. He was referred to as Brother William Fishbaugh. Does anyone know how old he was when he stood up here? 23 years old. A little bit about Brother Fishbaugh, according to a newspaper account. He was born in New Jersey. He worked in a cabinet shop where, according to this early newspaper account, he was his own teacher. There was no school, and there was always an open book laying beside the bench next to his tools. After 3 years here, young William wrote in the Universalist Union, a paper in Manhattan, an article called "The Cause and Opposition at the East End of Long Island." He was referring to the cause of is it Unitarian? Yes. He reports that one of the Greenport churches, and I'm not going to name that church, there's no point dredging up old wounds, so 100 and how many years ago? Quote, stands in battle array against universalism, though it must be confessed its mode of fighting is not a very honorable one. He goes on to say how the preacher in this church spreads terrible lies about what's going on in this building back in 1837. Then in the spirit of forgiveness and a focus on those things that Brother Fishbaugh can influence. He can't influence this preacher, but he can influence himself anyway, the words he speaks. He writes in the same article, "Friends, we have nothing to fear from such opposition. It cannot permanently injure us. But it will ultimately build us up. And I exhort you to not be discouraged. but to go on in the good work which we have commenced. I was very struck by this when I was reading the history of this church. He doesn't fan the flames of this fight between this church and that unnamed church in Greenport. Instead, he says, let's focus on what we can do to move forward and to do good works. And he chose a call to action that I think reflects a forgiving attitude. We're 3 days after the September 11th attacks, and mindful of the time here, so I'm going to try to do this briefly. We're 3 days after the anniversary of the September 11th attacks, and I remember watching the buildings go down. And my first reaction when I understood what happened, and I learned that one of my friends, Blake Wallens, who worked for Cantor Fitzgerald, was killed, was rage. First words, as my kids know it, was the F-bomb. And it already was being attributed to Islamic extremists. And my next words to a friend were, we should just nuke them. I was angry. I got a call, I don't know how many months later, from a woman who defends a lot of people that no one wants any part of, Judy Clark. And she asked me if I would be willing to be a defense expert in the case of Zacarias Moussaoui. At that time, it was believed he was the 20th hijacker. It turns out he had nothing to do with 9/11, but he was here as an Al-Qaeda member, learning to fly planes. And I was very reluctant to get involved. I had to face my own anger and my own hatred. And how did I do that? I'm not a saint. By any stretch of the imagination, my kids will tell you I'm not a saint. I got to know Zacarias. I met his mother. I met his sister. I sat in the mosque in London where he first learned about Islam. He wasn't raised Muslim. He was raised without any particular religion. His best friend was a Jewish boy who came as a young man and testified to save his life. Moussaoui chose to plead guilty. He said many outrageous things, for those of you who can't remember, like death to America. After I testified, he said, go back to Cuba, death to Amador. Face to face through the bars, he spit on me and told me if I could kill you, I would kill you. Victims for the prosecution were called for victim impact statements. And I was in the courtroom that day, and I heard, I think it was about 7 different people get up and talk about losing husbands, wives, children, parents. And the terrible sadness, but also the hate. Now this was during the part of the case where the prosecution was seeking the death penalty. Moussaoui already said, I'm guilty, I'm an Al-Qaeda terrorist. If I could, I would have been involved. So now there's a question of, does he die in prison of natural causes, or does he die with lethal injection? So the prosecution called these victims up. They spoke of really terrible, terrible pain. But they also spoke of, and I was struck by it, as many of us were, the wounds that were not healed. The anger that years after the attacks was as bright and as hot as the anger I felt when I saw those towers fall. And when I learned my friend Blake had gotten killed. I'd hoped to tell you a story about Blake, but we don't have time. But he was a kind, good man, a young man. And these victims spoke of wounds and misery that was unending. Wounds that were not healing, of depression, and worse. And then the defense did something very unusual. The defense called victims to give victim impact statements. There was a lot of fighting between the prosecution and the defense with the judge. Well, the defense can't call victims. Why can't they? Because there were victims who wanted to testify. They were not permitted to say anything about Zacarias Moussaoui, who was facing the death penalty. They were not permitted to say they forgive him publicly. were permitted to speak of their pain, their loss, and what they did with it. I'm going to read an edited version of a transcript. This is Paula Shapiro, who lost her son Eric in the towers. The defense attorney asked her, "Please state your name and spell your last name." And Paula says, "Paula Shapiro, P-A-U-L-A-S-H-A-P-I-R." Now imagine, literally the world press is there. I'm not kidding. I've never seen so many cameras. And this woman is up for the defense of, at that time, one of the most hated men. Not only in the U.S., but perhaps in many other countries. The next question, do you have children? She says, yes, I do. I have 2 children, Eric and Adina. And on September 11th, did you happen to speak to your son, Eric? As it happened, I was watching television when the first plane attack occurred. And I picked up. I could not remember which tower Eric worked in, and I picked up the telephone to call him, and literally, as I was holding it to call him, it rang, and it was Eric, and he said, "Don't worry, Mom, it's okay." It was the other tower. What did you do after you spoke to your son? I went back to watching television, and I saw his tower get hit, below the 89th floor where he worked. And I began to realize what at that point had possibly happened to my child. Did you speak to him again? I tried and I tried, but the phone just rang. Do you know anything about what your son did after you spoke to him? Yes, I know from colleagues he worked with who've contacted me. He got everybody out. Everybody that they could get out. They were busy evacuating their fellow employees. And because it was up so high, he was not one of the lucky ones. He was not able to get out. And how do you feel about what Eric did that day? A lot of people think I'm strange. I'm very proud of him, and I think he acted with honor and adhered to the values that I'd hoped I'd raised him with. Not because I want my child dead, but because he thought of other people first. He was a leader, and he thought about somebody else before himself. What did you do after you learned that he didn't make it out? There's a long list of horrible things that were happening during that time. One of the most horrible things was having to call my parents. They were about 84, 85 at that point. And to tell them that their only grandson was lost in the World Trade Center. I should note that after my testimony, I testified for 2 days explaining Masawi's mental illness. And I'm not saying that all terrorists are mentally ill, but Zacharias Masawi is mentally ill. Paula grabbed me and gave me a big hug and thanked me for my testimony. And we talked about her anger. And we talked a lot about forgiveness. And I can tell you, like every prosecution witness that was up there, she was angry. She felt the kind of hatred that they felt. Now the last part of her examination. The defense attorney asked her, "What have you done to heal from your loss?" I've worked with an organization that tries to present alternatives to retribution and violence with respect to the September 11th attacks. It's helping me. Do you miss Eric? I'll always miss my kid. How do you remember your son now? And she says, as this chubby little boy, who one night, when he went to sleep at about age 14, transformed overnight. His entire stomach moved up to his shoulders, started playing football. My nickname for him was Godzilla. He had a toy Godzilla on his desk in his office. He became comfortable with himself in a different way. I will always remember him as someone who was mature caring, loving, bright, a concerned citizen. And how do you want Eric to be remembered? As that kind of person, someone who values not only being in this country, but also the values of this country. And for me, I would probably say the top three things would be his fairness, his understanding, and his compassion. And that my hope is that he will not have died in vain. And I feel that it may happen if we lose those aspects of our culture: fairness, understanding, and compassion. You know, my tears are remembering what it was like to be in the court that day, and to see the love and the compassion and the forgiveness, even though these people who had lost so much couldn't say they forgave Zacharias or the other terrorists. I'll say very quickly some lessons I've learned on how I can forgive. I think I've already given the reasons why I try to forgive. They're pretty selfish reasons, really. I don't want to be miserable. But it is also a value that I have. It's something I do aspire to. I think it is the right way to live. Forgiving is not forgetting. I publicly forgave Fidel and Raul Castro in an op-ed I wrote 7 years ago. But I won't forget that I have to be careful when people behave in certain ways. What do I do? First, self-forgiveness. I have a little ritual I do most mornings, almost every morning. I make a list of things I'm grateful for, and then I try and think about the shortcomings. One of the biggest ones is being short-tempered with my children. And make a commitment to strive to do better today. I love Gail's opening words. I use those words every morning. It's from a Sanskrit proverb. Look well. Look to this day, for it is life. So I say that as well. And if I'm feeling sorry for myself, that's the royal road to resentment. I question that. And again, look to those things that I have in my life, the new friends I have in my life. I'm looking at one now. The new community I have in my life. I'm looking at all of you. I make a list of things I'm grateful for, and I find that the anger starts to evaporate. But self-forgiveness is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. I also remember that I have to practice self-reflection and think about things the missteps, the things I do that are sometimes wrong. And then I make a quick daily prayer or meditation, if you prefer, and I send out good wishes to the people I'm angry at, the people that have harmed me, or my children, or my family, or my friends. I'm thinking of someone in particular right now, and for 4 years, most days when I wake up, I say that I hope that, and I say her name, I hope that you're having a good day, and that you're being a good parent, and a good friend, and that you're happy. I send her that wish every morning. My anger has really mostly gone away. It's pretty rare that I feel angry anymore. And it's an incredible gift. And it's a freedom that opens other doors. The last thing I do is I practice using what I call my empathy net. In a book that I wrote, I talk about a car cutting me off and being furious, and imagining this guy behind the wheel who purposely cut in front of me on Main Road. And he's a SOB and other words I won't mention here. And really angry, and I start tailgating him. And his taillights go on. And I'm getting more angry, and I'm certain he's doing this on purpose. And then I go and I pass him abruptly and angrily. Now, I did write this book 6 years ago, so I don't think I'm that much of a terrorist driver. And as I'm passing him, what do I see? But a woman who had to be at least in her 80s, looking frightened, hunkered down behind the wheel. For those women in their 80s, I mean no disrespect, but this woman appeared frightened. I frightened her. She certainly wasn't this bulked out guy with a Budweiser next to him. So empathy is important, understanding. And when we don't know the person, we don't know why they run this, to try to imagine maybe why they run it. Their sufferings, their limitations, their weaknesses. So, again, sending out a meditation or a prayer to the people I'm angry at, practicing acceptance, surrendering in order to win. I can't change them, just like Reverend Fishbaugh. He couldn't change that church and what they were saying, but he could say, let me do the right things today. And practicing empathy, looking to find some understanding that's empathic and compassionate. Again, it helps me in my life, it helps the life of those around me, and I think it's the right thing. Also the right thing to do in life.